For this scene analysis, we're going to look at some familiar image and parallel scenes. We've got one scene where it's pretty much the same scene but just in reverse, and then we have one that's more like familiar image. And looking at the context of these can help us understand how the characters are evolving. So let's look at these two scenes of Chiron's mother yelling at him. So that was from the first part in the film, section 1, Little. Now let's look at the scene again. It's played in reverse, and it's showing us the shift from part 2 to part 3, from Chiron to black. Okay, so with the first scene, we have Little pretty much centered and looking beaten down, kind of helpless. Behind him is the blue light that's kind of highlighting the door frame, but we also have the yellowy lights of the fridge, his shirt, and the lamp. And what's interesting is the second part of the film, Chiron, is kind of dominated by yellows, much like the first part has lots of blues in it. So the color blue is connected with Juan and the story that he tells about his name when he was called Blue. So does the door represent an escape, an exit from his mother's constant assault? How often yellow is often seen as a color of fear or of cowardice. Is this suggesting his fear of what he's facing? Home is supposed to be a place of solace, but here it's much more like a prison cell. He's trapped here, but when he goes outside, it's another kind of cell. He's trapped wherever he goes. He has to constantly be worried about what people are going to do to him. Juan, on the other hand, and Teresa are his only place of solace. And Juan is associated with that color blue. The blue of the ocean, the story that he tells him about, the solace of the floating in the water, even Juan's living room. And this is all in contrast to the red that is associated with his mother here, and the constant emotional violence he has to face from her. The first time we see the scene, we don't hear what she says. We just hear this chaotic orchestra sounds that kind of seem to mimic the chaos that's going on in his mind. But the second time we see it, we actually hear what she says. She says, "Don't look at me," which suggests a kind of guilt on her part. She knows what she's doing is wrong, and she doesn't want to face that judgment from Chiron. But the second time we see it, we also realize that this is something that's been haunting Chiron his whole life. It's followed him into adulthood and shows that he has PTSD. Don't look at me! Imagine awakening night after night to this haunting image, this constant assault of memory. Don't look at me! Don't look at me! Don't look at me! And this is how we're introduced to section 3, black. So two things follow Chiron here. One, the memory and kind of trauma from that he received from his mother, but also his name that he has here in the third section, Black. Remember that it's Kevin who gave him that name. So it's interesting that he's chosen that name as an adult. especially when we think of how Juan has told him that he needs to choose what he's going to be called. So has he kept this name because of a nostalgia for Kevin, or does it have to do more symbolically with the blackness of his life and what he has to survive and live through that has brought him to this dark place? Human beings are complicated, and I don't know that it has to be one or the other. I think it can be both together. Now this scene moves into a familiar image. We've seen this image of Chiron immersing his face into ice water like this, although it's not as blue as it is here. The first time we see this here, this scene, is after he's been beaten up by Kevin in that, horrible scene of betrayal. And the first time we see it here, we can see it as a kind of first aid, an attempt to mitigate the swelling, numb the pain. But in addition, remember, he's just been brutalized by his potential first love. This is a huge betrayal. The ice here, I think, suggests that this is when the blood in his veins goes ice cold. That this is when he emotionally shuts down in ways that he hasn't up to this point. So when we see him the second time dunking his face into this water, it's even bluer. Blue ice is often associated with glaciers and that deep, deep cold. And so here it suggests that Chiron, or Black as he's known now here, has grown even colder in adulthood. So we see two things that have followed Chiron here. This ice, this deep blue cold ice, which he first plunged his face in after Kevin beat him up, and then the name Black, which is what Kevin named him when they were children. And so the PTSD from what happened with Kevin, as well as what happened with the mother, follows him into adulthood. Let's look at one more thing in this scene analysis. The film does an incredible job of using a variety of kinds of music, and this opening scene into section 3 and Black and Chiron's adulthood starts with Goody Mob's Cell Therapy. So let's watch the scene, listen to the song, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Scene unfolds, young girls, 13 years old, exposed themselves to any Tom, Dick, and hate. Got more, stretch marks to these hoes, hollering they got raped.
My colleague Jason Kordich, who has written extensively about hip-hop, explains that this song by Goody Mob, Cell Therapy, is a layered song that in part is talking about the various divisions that exist in society and how those divisions impede on a person's sense of self. Divisions like jail, gated communities, drugs, gangs. The chorus is, "Who's that peeking in my window?" So in part, these divisions set up a constant surveillance where they're being watched. In each section, it brings up the idea of being a victim and what comes from that as well. Chiron's character is familiar with all of these cells that the song is talking about, but there's an added cell of growing up gay in Black culture that is also affecting Chiron. It's growing up in these cells, these different types of traps or cages that Chiron has been caught in, that has created this figure, this character who's had to rebuild himself as hard, who has to wear these grills, put on these masks of masculinity, of not being a pushover, so that he can feel like he can survive in the world. Cell therapy, or the medical term cellular therapy, is a therapy in which viable cells are injected or grafted or implanted into a patient in order to effectuate a medicinal effect. And in this case, I wonder if it's Kevin who re-enters his life, who presents a different way of having grown up and becoming somebody that is possibly a kind of therapy that allows Chiron to be vulnerable, to not have to fear all that he's feared his whole life, which is what leads to that final scene of intimacy and possibly love in his future.